like to welcome you to this joint presentation tonight with the Iowa City area group of the Sierra Club, along with 1,000 Friends of Iowa. My name is Tom Karsner. I'm a member of the Sierra Club, our Iowa City area group. And our topic tonight is land use in Johnson County and land use in Iowa. And what we want to talk about is some local issues, some local history of land use. And then our second speaker tonight is Carrie Carney. She's Executive Director of 1,000 Friends of Iowa. And 1,000 Friends has been around for several years and is the leading group in Iowa on land use and fighting urban sprawl. Carrie is going to bring an angle more focused on central Iowa, but certainly not exclusive to central Iowa. And we'll go through both presentations and then have questions and answers. You'll find some things similar in both presentations, and you'll find some things different. And the last part of our evening is to give you some direction on the ongoing development of a new comprehensive plan in Johnson County. This is something that occurs every 10 years. Land use is one part of it. From my perspective, it's an awfully big part of it, but it's not the only part of it. And the Johnson County Board of Supervisors are involved in that, and there's a citizens committee that's also been meeting and giving and getting input on the Johnson County Comprehensive Plan. And at the end, I'll give a little more direction as to upcoming meetings and events so that you can participate in that process. And we have a few people tonight who have been involved in that in one way or another, and perhaps they can give us some insight as well as we ask questions and have a little bit of a conversation at the end. I do want to make one announcement that in co-sponsorship with 100 Grannies, on October 16th, as part of their environmental film series, they will be showing the new Al Gore film that was out in the theaters in July and August, an inconvenient sequel, Truth to Power. And that will be October 16th, 6 p.m. in the Senior Center here in Iowa City, room 202. Again, that's October 16th, 6 p.m., Senior Center, room 202. An inconvenient sequel, Truth to Power, the new Al Gore documentary. And I encourage you to go to that if you didn't get a chance to see the film in the theaters, and there'll be some discussion time afterward as well. Well, I'm going to start the presentation tonight, and there's names and some contact information. And just by the way, the Sierra Club local group has a Facebook page, and we also have a website. And 1,000 Friends of Iowa also have a website. I assume you have a Facebook page?
We do.
And
it is 1,000 friends, not 100 friends.
oh, okay, I messed it up. Thank you, thank you. Okay, it's 1,000 friends. It has grown. It reached 1,000 friends pretty quickly. Thanks. Sorry to show that typo there. What I want to do is give a quick overview of zoning in Johnson County. And what I'm talking about is primarily rural residential development, housing in rural areas of Johnson County. Give a quick overview of that to show how we've gotten to where we are now, and then to talk a little bit toward the end of where we're going from here. In this first slide, the important area here You can see that at the bottom, you've got Interstate 80, and then on the left side is Interstate 380. The orangish color is the original 10,000 acres back in 1960 when Johnson County adopted zoning for the first time. This is the original residential area that the county set aside for rural residential development. And as you can see, most of the west part of that is what today we'd call River Heights, and going on up into North Liberty, and as you get up to some of the peninsula areas around the Coralville Reservoir. And then there's the area directly north of Iowa City, and then you get, it goes up on Prairie du Chien for the most part, and a little bit into Sugar Bottom Road up to the north near Solon. Though that is the original area designated for residential growth in Johnson County. 1979 is the first year that the phrase North Corridor development area was published in any county publications. 1982, they had their first plan. 1984 was the first time that boundaries were established. And the 1997 land use plan fully talked about the North Corridor. And we'll get into a little bit more of how it grew and then expanded through the years. This slide it's not completely easy to see, but it is a comparison. Again, this is a map of the county. And what's important is on the left-hand page, you'll see that there are several small dots or black areas. These were areas that were zoned residential by the County Board of Supervisors. Unfortunately, in a relatively unplanned fashion, as proposals came forward, rezonings to residential were approved routinely without a plan, without a pattern. After 1998, on the right-hand side, there's very few of those. And what this is showing is that after the adoption of a stronger North Corridor development area plan, that these random type of zonings decreased significantly. And from a land use perspective, it is much, much better to have a plan, to have a pattern of development thought out ahead of time. This slide moves to post-1998 through about 2003. And you can see that the yellow area is, again, areas that have become zoned residential. You can see that it's expanded from the original 10,000 acres. It has filled in some areas as well. And this was also the beginning of a period post-1998 when the Board of Supervisors began to get some big ideas. And I had been involved, I started getting involved in the mid to early 1990s because I saw these spot zonings going on and knowing that it just wasn't good. And what's important to see about this map in particular, the green outline is the 1997 version of the North Corridor development area. And it was called Phase 1. The purple outlined areas vastly expanded the North Corridor development area. It was called Phase 2. And in the supervisor's mind, they thought that after that they had designs for road plans to expand the road network in the existing North Corridor development area, Phase 1. And that after 5 years, that would be developed and a lot more people would move in there, and then they could move into Phase 2, the purple outlined areas. This was the beginning of Newport Road, Prairie du Chien, Sugar Bottom Road, where the supervisors had big ideas to pave those roads, to bring those up what I and a group of people began to call half an interstate, and take a significantly wider right-of-way, and taking out a few homes and many trees along the way, and increasing the speed limit significantly. This started in 1999, and it wasn't until 2007, myself and a group of other people fought this tooth and nail, and finally, the supervisors, it was only through electing a better board of supervisors and defeating an incumbent supervisor that that plan was eventually defeated and shelved. And also, in the 1998 plan was also the beginning of what's called rural cluster development or conservation subdivision design, where you could have more homes, you could have greater density if you put 50% of the land into open space or reserved areas. So this was also part of their idea of, at the same time, increasing development, but also conserving some land. I thought it was kind of contradictory then, and I think it's kind of contradictory now. But that was the plan 10 years ago. This slide is from 2006, and again, it shows the original residential development, and then up in the northern part of the county, it shows more residential development, again on those peninsular areas, Sandy Beach Road and other places up on the northern part of the county. And then also on the southern part, you can see some Rapid Creek Road development increasing there. Finally, in 2008, this is what the last comprehensive plan committee, or supervisors in their last comprehensive plan came up with. And this is what exists today. The pink area is the existing North Corridor development area. And what's important to point out is that over the years, the North Corridor development area, which I guess I should have said this at the beginning, what that really means, it's like an overlay district. It means that if your land is not yet zoned residential, but you live in that area and you want to apply for residential zoning, you're given preference. It's given, in essence, a benefit of the doubt. It's not automatic. It still has to go through lots of steps, and but it is given some advantage in a rezoning process. But you can see here that from the previous plans in '98, and even going back to in the '80s, that the North Corridor has already contracted significantly. What happened in 2008 is phase one is maintained basically, although even that is contracted, and phase two, though, is eliminated completely. So the point is that the boundaries of the North Corridor area have expanded, have grown, contracted, and contracted, all without any lawsuits, without any loss of property rights. No one has a right to a rezoning. You have a right to ask for a rezoning, but no one has a right to expect an automatic rezoning. So this is where we presently are. But when you look at the 2008 land use plan, these are some of the statements made in it of the goals of the 2008 land use plan. I'm not going to go through every point of it, except to say that these apply everywhere in the county, except in the North Corridor development area, the area in pink there. These are great goals to have: minimize conflicts between incompatible land uses, encourage infill and sequential development. In other words, have a plan. But none of this applies to the North Corridor development area. And I think the existence of the North Corridor development area promotes sprawl because there is no priority or plan. It encourages the loss of farmland. It creates incompatible uses. It changes neighborhoods from ag to residential. It takes away our scenic areas. And in the worst example, in 2013, it led to a development called the Dooley Farm, which is up on Newport Road in the 2900 block, which was a proposal just outside of the fringe area, 2 miles, or beyond 2 miles from the Iowa City boundary. It's actually about 3 miles outside of Iowa City, proposed to have 70 homes on 90 acres. And far from infrastructure and services, it could create a small town of about 300 people in an area that is primarily agriculture. And this was the consequence, the worst consequence so far, and hopefully the worst ever, of what the North Corridor development area could lead to. This is a close-up slide of the present North Corridor development area. And again, to go through it a little more in detail, people ask, well, if we don't have this, where will people build houses? Where can people live? Well, another secret that's not all that well known is over 57 years since we started zoning in 1960, there are 1,600 residentially zoned and platted lots throughout the county ready to be built on tomorrow. They're already zoned residential, they're platted, they're ready to go. And that's part of the dots that we saw on that previous map. Somewhere, some board of supervisors approved a residential rezoning for that area and said this is a good use of that land. But it wasn't done, frankly, with much forethought. So there are 1,600 of these lots still available. A second place where people could build homes are obviously in our cities. The basic idea is that you grow from the cities outward organically through basically through the pace of annexation, which in general in Johnson County has been pretty good. You could build in our villages. These are the smaller unincorporated towns, Morse, Joetown, Frytown, Cosgrove, Wyndham, Sharon Center, Sutliff, and such. And a fourth area where you could grow is in fringe areas, basically 1 mile from the border of cities. So that's an answer to the question, we're not no growth, we're not shutting off growth, we're just redirecting growth. And here's an interesting document. This is from 2012, and this is a planning document, the Metropolitan Planning, I always get the acronym wrong, but it's their boundary for where they think metropolitan area of Iowa City will be in 25 years. Well, in 2037, the only area that is shown, the only part of the North Corridor development area, significant part of it, is that area on the middle right, that thumb sticking up, and that Highway 1 is on the right-hand side. In 25 years, that's the only area on the east side of the river that they see as part of a metropolitan, that has a metropolitan future for Iowa City. So that's another idea of future planning. And this is a map that shows each of the cities in Iowa City and their fringe area. That's the light green. And the darker area is the existing North Corridor development area. I think I'm going to leave my presentation here right now and come back with a few more points after Carrie. But because this sort of brings us up to the present as to where we are now. And Carrie's going to talk about a viewpoint from the state of Iowa, again, primarily central Iowa, but also other places in the state. And then I'll come back and give a little more detailed perspective on the Johnson County Comprehensive Plan.
Hi, I am Carrie Carney. I'm the Executive Director of 1,000 Friends of Iowa. And 1,000 Friends of Iowa, it's a crazy name, I know. The idea around it was that if you had, this was back many years, but if you had 1,000 people all donating $100 to the organization, you would have a $100,000 budget and have a sustainable budget, was the idea behind it. Again, that was many years ago. But 1,000 Friends is a concept that there's organizations across the country with the same name. That's a concept of organizations focused solely on land use. And so here in Iowa, our focus is really about getting everyday people engaged in land use decisions. Because let's face it, how many of you have been involved in making the decisions about where the development areas were going to be in Johnson County? Okay, 2 people in this room. Right. But let's face it, who is it that's normally making those decisions? Who drives development? Realtors. It's the people who own, it's developers and realtors who own farmland that want to sell it to make a big profit, not because they care about where people live or because they actually believe they need the housing, but because they know they can make a lot of money. So where I'm at, I'm on a small farm about 3 miles south of Cumming, Iowa, kind of close to the bridges of Madison County. I raise sheep and border collies. So, and West Des Moines has decided that they're not satisfied being just in Polk County, so they've expanded into Dallas County, Madison County, and now into Warren County where I'm at, and they're proposing to take up the bike trail and put in a 6-lane freeway just north of my house, and they're also, in their long-range plan, are proposing to put a new exit right through the south side of my farm. That's on their long-range plan, because a developer owns the land right south to me. And it's the developers who are driving all of the development, because communities do stupid things like offer tax abatements for developers. So if you build a new house and somebody buys it, you could get a 7-year, 100% tax abatement, right? So that's great if you're the homeowner and don't have to pay taxes for 7 years, but what it does is it drives sprawl. And it drives a lot of problems that we have with urban sprawl. So those are some of the things we're working on. So for example, anybody heard of Adel, Iowa? So Adel, Iowa, we just had a big success there. A developer happened to be the Community Economic Development Director of Adel, Iowa, owned a bunch of land right just south of the interstate, but it was about 10 miles north of where the city limits of Adel was. So they decided they wanted the city of Adel to annex a whole strip of land all along the highway up to their land so that they could have a development there, because they couldn't sell the farmland for the prices they wanted to sell it without getting the tax abatement, and they could only get the tax abatement if they were in the city limits. But luckily, we just defeated that this summer, so that's not going to happen. And it was because people got involved and fought it. So I'm kind of curious to hear from you guys. What do you think Johnson County should look like? I mean, what do you want to see it look like?
My name is Ryan Hall. I would like to share a little vision that I could have for this county. And I think it's Blair, right? I think it's a lot to do with Blair's vision, is that I think this county is very fertile, with mines and with land. And that we have an amazing host of resources in our community, whether they're educational or institutional or cultural. And I would like to see in this county much more food production, much more prairie restoration, much less development on floodplains where we just had a flood, University of Iowa. And some more collaboration amongst cities within the county to encourage better transportation to avoid sprawl. I grew up in a suburb of Detroit where sprawl killed community, where it left us kind of with very little to enjoy. So I'm glad I am in a more densely populated Iowa city right now than I am in the suburb of Detroit. But I think we have to be really intentional about who we are bringing to the table, whose voices are being heard, and what the long-term goal is, because my generation is going to adopt all of these bad zoning policies that have developed our county into what will be our pavement future. This is the climate reality that we will be facing in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. And one of the things, so we're going to get to this here in a second, one of the things that I heard before we started today was this gentleman here who came in and said, how is this comprehensive planning process advertised? Well, you know, one of the problems that happens with comprehensive plans and zoning plans and so forth is usually communities do just what they have to do required by law to let people know. You usually don't see a front page story about it. It's usually not a big headline. Usually the public meetings are limited to just the minimum number of public meetings they have to have. Now, I don't know if that was the case here in Iowa City, in Johnson County with the comprehensive plan, but I know in Des Moines, it's been pretty minimal around the zoning plan. We got them to expand the comment period, but it has not been a huge effort to get the community involved in the zoning, in the updated zoning code that's going on right now in Des Moines. And there's some good things about it, but there's also some bad things about it, like it really limits solar expansion in Iowa. So that's one of the things. It really limits urban agriculture ability in the area. So there's things that people really do need to go forward. So kind of in response to what you said, because one of the things I heard you say is you wish that there was a topographical map on the North Central Corridor. When I look at this, I instantly say, boy, I don't know if I think that makes sense as a good development area. So when you just look at the pink zone, that's the North Central Corridor, what's the first thing you notice besides the pink? The river and the lake, right. So what happens when you have really hilly land and you start putting development areas there, and then you strip off all the topsoil? What happens to that river and to that lake? Not just erosion, you have runoff and pollution. Now, is Saylorville Lake the drinking water source for Iowa City? Or is it one of the it's not? This river? The river is the drinking water source. Yeah. So right now in Iowa, 2 years ago, 2015, the Iowa DNR eliminated a requirement for developers to have to put topsoil back onto the ground when they did development. That rule was put in place because of all the flooding and because of our really polluted waters in Iowa. They eliminated that. So now developers can find a loophole. If they say it's inconvenient or not feasible, they don't have to do it. So if you develop all that area, you're destroying the water here. I mean, that, to me, that's the first thing I see when I see that. You're also putting the community at great risk for more flooding. You talked about flooding. Why would you develop on a floodplain? Because I'm pretty sure that's floodplain all up and down along there. It just doesn't make sense to really squander our resources. And our natural resources, quite honestly, aren't going to be around for very much longer if we don't really seriously change the way we're looking at things. This is a picture, it's a beautiful piece of land, right? This is the land that was zoned to have housing development on it. Yeah, this is it. This is right across the street. This is a farm that's right across the street where they're raising cows and doing, have a lovely little farm. These people don't want this development going up across the road from them. I mean, I know I live in the country because I want it to farm, but I also do a lot of conservation practices. We're doing some prairie restoration. We're doing all sorts of stuff. We also live on very hilly, highly erodible land, so we don't have row crops. We do prairie hay for our sheep, and we do rotational grazing and do a lot of conservation practices. But what we're doing is actually better for the land than if a housing development went up on it. A whole lot better for the land. We have a river across the road from us and a creek that goes on the north side of our property. It would be devastating if a housing development got built in our area. I've driven up and down this corridor. I kind of feel that this whole place got developed also. That'd be pretty devastating also. So let's just talk a little bit about the impacts of urban sprawl. So did you guys know that every single year Iowa loses 26,000 acres of farmland to sprawl, to development, to new roads and housing developments and big box stores? 26,000 acres of farmland. And do you know across the country, we lose close to 2 million acres of farmland every year across the country to development of farmland, natural areas, and underdeveloped land. That's a lot of land. Did you also know that it takes 500 years to replace 1 inch of soil? This is not a renewable resource. When it's gone, it's gone. And do people really want to lose that? I mean, I know I don't. I really don't. So let's talk a little bit about the impacts of urban sprawl besides just losing all the wonderful farmland. We have an increased dependency on automobiles. The further out you have, right now, these urban sprawls and these urban developments are driving a dependency on automobiles and driving a dependency on fossil fuels. We have a reduced quality of life because we're damaging our water. I mean, Iowa has some of the dirtiest waters in the nation. Air pollution, soil loss. I mean, people who live in housing developments, one of our members of our board had initially bought a house in a housing development. She couldn't ever grow grass, and anytime it rained, their basement flooded and their whole yard flooded because they had stripped off all the topsoil and never put it back. She now lives on a farm and decided to switch. And it's a real strain on city budgets and county budgets because now we have to provide services further and further out. And let's talk about climate change. So you were talking about the good things that Johnson County and Iowa City has done. Let's face it, Johnson County is the most progressive county in this state. They've led the way on a lot of things. Dubuque is kind of right up there with Iowa City, kind of battling out for who's the most sustainable city in the state. But Johnson County, the county supervisors set greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. They set to set to reduce their goals, it's actually should be 28%, 25 to 28% by 2025 and 50% by 2080, in agreement with the Paris Climate Agreement. That's a pretty big goal. And they've already started doing stuff on it. This is the solar field that Johnson County put up. Not only did they put up the solar field, but underneath that, they restored all the topsoil, so they were doing a topsoil project underneath. There's a lot of things like this that Johnson County is doing. But you know the number one thing that Johnson County could do to address climate change? The number one thing is stop urban sprawl. Land use is your number one weapon against climate change. Because what happens when you do urban sprawl? A, you're increasing greenhouse gas emissions by increasing dependency on automobiles. But B, you're taking away all the soil, all the trees, and everything that sequesters and captures carbon and greenhouse gases. So not only are you increasing your greenhouse gases, you're reducing your ability to get rid of them. That's the best tool in fighting climate change. So the role of land use in regulating greenhouse gas, in regulations and greenhouse gas mitigation, it's really extremely important. And so the things you really need to do is encourage development patterns that allow less and less reliance on automobiles. So more infill development, more apartments, more compact development within existing city limits. Not only does that reduce dependency on automobiles, but it also reduces the strain on city and county budgets. Because now cities don't have to build new schools out in the county. They don't have to provide more services out in the county where it's strapping them, and where they're strapped. They don't have to provide tax abatements out in the county and reduce their budgets that way. It's really helpful. There's so many studies out there that show the ill effect of what urban sprawl is doing. West Des Moines, right now the way the system West Des Moines has, they can't pay for a development that they just approved without getting another development. It's like a vicious cycle because they can't afford it, because they don't have any money coming in because they're giving tax abatements and then they're really stretched on providing services. Imagine having to provide fire services in 4 counties. I mean, that's kind of crazy. It's bad enough in 1 county. Preserving existing trees that sequester carbon and require the planting of new trees. Preserving and restoring topsoil that also sequester carbon, and protecting farmland and natural areas. Promoting alternative energy uses, and do less reliance on fossil fuels. These are the key things that you can do with land use, and this comprehensive plan is Johnson County's tool right now to be able to do something about it. So by taking farmland and sensitive areas out of your comprehensive plan, you can have a bigger impact on addressing climate than you will just by doing things like the solar array and so forth. You have to be able to keep your natural areas there. We also want people to take a look at, I think I'm boring people. We also would like to see Johnson County really think about following the smart growth and smart development 10 principles. So there's 10 main principles. Make sure when you're looking at your comp plans and your zoning plans that you're creating spaces for mixed land uses. So one of our problems right now with how we do zoning and comprehensive plans is that we designate each area for a single use. So this is just houses, this is just retail, this is just industry. And then you're also causing people to have to drive more. So mixed land uses, compact building design, there are a lot of places in the city of Iowa City where you can continue to build additional housing. But as Tom said, 1,600 places that are already zoned residential, you don't need to add more. And it's one of the things in smart growth that they tell you to do, and actually the City Development Board looks at this in annexation. If you have other areas that are zoned already as residential and they're not being built on, they don't want to approve annexations for new development when you already have places, lots that aren't getting built on. So it's important to think about that. Creating a range of housing options. You don't need to do that in the north corridor. Walkable, bikeable, friendly neighborhoods, can't get that if you keep sprawling out and out and out. Designing distinctive, attractive communities and a sense of place, preserving open space, farmland, critical environmental areas, and I won't read the rest. But the most important thing is that you guys are involved. So everybody's voice needs to be heard. So show up for the public meetings when they're there. Really start asking your county supervisors to figure out a better way that they can let the public know. If people aren't finding out about when the hearings and so forth are, I'm pretty sure there's at least a couple people on the Board of Supervisors who are going to listen to you and say, hey, if we need to make sure more people have the ability to know about this, what can we do differently to get the word out? Because they want people to support, to come forward and get involved. At least a couple of the supervisors I know do. So I think if you asked them, they would make sure that more people found out. One of the other things that you could push for, you got great county supervisors now, at least a few of them, ag buffer zones. This will help a lot, is passing an ordinance that requires developers to create a minimum of a 100-foot buffer between the edge of any development and agricultural land. And that buffer should include trees and other things to prevent a buffer. The founder of 1,000 Friends of Iowa is a farmer in northern Polk County. And Ankeny's been sprawling all around them. They farm about 2,000 acres of land, and each one of their fields is now surrounded by urban sprawl. And even to the point where the mayor, as they're developing their new comprehensive plan, and the mayor came and talked to her and was asking her about the land and what she'd want to see from the city. And they were having a nice conversation, and he was talking about, and you know, what's your future plans for the farm? And she said, well, my kids plan to come back to the farm and farm it when we retire. And this is a true story. The mayor said, no, your kids cannot come back and farm that land because we need it for development because my kids want to come and live here. This is what the mayor told them. So this new development went up right next to her pasture where she keeps her bulls. And the guy in one of the houses who borders the pasture decided he didn't like looking at the ugly barbed wire fence that was along the edge of her pasture. He had a 40-foot frontage to her pasture. So he went one weekend, cut out the barbed wire fence and pulled the post up because he didn't want to look at the fence anymore. Well, guess what happened with her bulls? Yeah, he had bulls in his backyard. He ended up having to go put that back, but we think ag buffer zones is a great way to help mitigate some of that for any development that does want to happen to help protect farmers and farmland. And I've kind of babbled on quite a bit, so I don't know if, Tom, you said you had some other stuff to do, but please make sure you guys get involved and don't sit this one out on the comprehensive plan.
Where Carrie left off is what can you do? And to pick that up, this is a screenshot of one of the first proposals through staff, through the county staff, and through 2 meetings of the Board of Supervisors about actual residential zoning boundaries. And this map is complicated, and I'm not trying to explain it all, except the yellow area is zoned residential and is, well, it's proposed to be zoned residential. But the biggest thing out of this map is there is no longer a proposal for the North Corridor development area. It's not final, but this is the map that the county supervisors are beginning their work on, which I think is a step forward. Now, what this is actually called is a future land use map, and in exchange for eliminating the North Corridor development area, they are expanding some areas of residential zoning contiguous to already existing ones. And again, this map is not, well, it was the first map. Things have already changed since then in the meetings I've been to, and more things will change. But the major point here is that they are starting to work with a map that doesn't have the North Corridor development area on it. And you ask, how can you get involved? Well, that's what I want to tell you about, is the next meeting, well, at the top, jocoplan.com is the one central location where you can catch up and where you can see what's coming for the Comprehensive Plan Committee that has been meeting, the Board of Supervisors, there's minutes and I believe recordings are also linked there. You can catch up as best you can on all the events of the planning process, which started back in the winter, January or December, I believe, where they had meetings in several towns. But the next few events coming up are next Monday, October 2nd. The supervisors will meet and go over maps again in great detail. It won't be the last meeting, but then on the following Monday, the supervisors are having a listening post. The whole comprehensive plan, I think, I'm not sure it's going to be at a 90% point yet, but it's going to, they'll publish as much of it as they can at that point. And this is an opportunity for you and for all the people watching on TV and others to come and express your opinion. It could be as formal as a public hearing, or it may be less formal than that. But the intention is that the supervisors want to listen to county citizens for 2 hours. That's Monday, October 9th, and that's in the Health and Human Services Building, which is right across the street, right across Benton Street there from the County Administration Building. Then in November, Thursday, November 2nd, the Comprehensive Plan Committee will get one more look at a nearly complete plan, and the public is also invited to come and give comments there. It's also in the Health and Human Services Building. You can see that. But if you want to keep up to date on other meetings and other events, go to jocoplan.com. So I've gone over a little bit of background of land use zoning in Johnson County and where we are, where we're at the doorstep of the new county comprehensive plan, which won't be finalized until, probably January or February of next year. So there's still plenty of time for input, but things are happening. And if you have opinions, it's important to talk to the supervisors. But there's also some things that will occur after the comprehensive plan and is adopted, and that will have an effect. And there's 2 particular issues there's not a lot of detail because there's no actual proposals on the table, but there's two ideas out there. Is one of ag tourism or agricultural tourism. And this is the idea that farms or other agricultural operations can add some, I call it a side business or other operations selling some of the produce that some of the things that they produce on their land under a conditional use permit or other means. But the one thing, there's actually two things that I want to comment on that particular point. We've had 2 incidents of excess, I believe, in that area just recently. One was the Rapid Creek Cidery. Again, I've said I'm agnostic on the cidery itself. I'm interested in the zoning of it. What happened was, and what presently exists today, due to a generous discretionary decision by the county administrator, county planning and zoning administrator, we now have a 400 seats event center with unlimited number of events available and a restaurant on agricultural zoned land. That's never happened before in the 57 years of zoning in Johnson County. In fact, it's a violation of our county ordinance, which specifically says both those types of developments should only occur on commercial zoned land. But there's not much we can do in retrospect on those two issues. But it occurred partially because they were done by conditional use permit and not through the regular zoning process of the Board of Supervisors. It's too big, in my opinion, to use the conditional use permit process. It should be something that the Board of Supervisors decides. And a second example, just in the last month, is a proposal of Versaland, a farm near Morse in Johnson County, where a proposal was made to put on 64 acres. The proposal was to put 36 cabins there, but the problem the request was to zone it to agricultural residential, which could have allowed up to 80 to 100 residential homes in a different configuration. The County Planning and Zoning Commission and the Board of Supervisors voted that down. Versaland, the proposal was to have some fishing and other types of associated agricultural uses there. Again, could have come under the ag tourism. I bring up those 2 points to say that, yes, we need to allow some more opportunities for agricultural production and sales in the county, but we need to be careful of going too big, because these are really, in my opinion, both commercial operations that could have been zoned commercial. So that's one issue, ag tourism, that we're going to face within the coming year. The second issue, and it's been alluded to here tonight, is the ability to have farms less than 40 acres in size and to have residential homes on them. And it's that second part that is not impossible, but it's difficult, yes, it's difficult to enter agriculture today when 40 acres seems to be the minimum size of a parcel of land to purchase, simply, if nothing else, because of money, but for a lot of other reasons too. If we can shrink that down to 5 or 10 or pick your number of acres, that would make entry into agriculture and small producers, it would make it much easier for them. But how do you balance that with the desire of people wanting to live on their land? And thinking, again, 2 or 3 owners down the line. And there are some ideas of how to do that with conservation easements or a contract with a parent farm. But that's an issue that Johnson County is wrestling with right now. So those are the 2 things that I wanted to also put out there, ag tourism and smaller farms. Again, these are ways to involve yourself in the process, and Carrie and I are going to entertain questions from you at this point, and we need to get you on the mic if you want to be heard.
When it comes to visions for the North Corridor, I would just like to make known my point of view, which is pretty much diametrically opposed to that of Mr. Dom's. When I first moved to Iowa City about 50 years ago, and my first exposure to the North Corridor was the drive on Newport Road and Sugar Bottom Road out to Lake McBride, and the discovery of what a marvelous scenic corridor that was at the time, and to a considerable extent still is. And subsequently, bicycle rides on that same route. It was not until many years later, about 10 years or so later, we purchased a property that's off of Newport Road, with some ag land, and he's correct, it's not terribly productive for row cropping land, and it's mostly the ridge tops that are used for row crops. But there's very valuable timberland, and the particular spot where we are is in a zone bordered by Highway 1, I-80, and Prairie du Chien Newport Road. And when you look at a county map, that is one of the largest roadless areas in Johnson County. And as we lived on that property for 45 years or so, and at the time we bought that, we thought this could be a good investment because someday the city's going to come out here and developers are going to pay us a whole lot of money for this land. Well, it turned out to be that was a pretty good prophecy, and in recent years we have found developers do want to pay us a lot of money for that property so they could put in roads and houses. But our view now is of that as not only a scenic corridor, but a wildlife corridor and a corridor of natural lands, natural woodlands, and we're trying to establish a prairie on it. And it is, to me, a much more valuable corridor of natural preservation and a wildlife migration corridor as well, because I know from work we did with wildlife agencies out west that in grizzly bear and wolf recovery, that the single biggest factor in successful recovery of those endangered animals was roadless areas. And so the idea that this should be converted from a scenic and wildlife and natural area corridor to a corridor of roads and housing development, it just makes me somewhat sick.
Thank you for saying that. I think one of the things that, in my experience doing this, is that you hear a lot of developers and real estate people and a lot of city and county officials who look at a piece of land and they don't see the value of it unless it's built on. And you hear it all the time. As a matter of fact, I was at a meeting recently and somebody said, oh, but there's just this big blank land there. It'll be nice once there's something on it, then it'll be worth something. And we've got to change that mindset so that people see the value in leaving it alone, because it is productive and actually more valuable in the long run, leaving it alone and letting it be a wildlife corridor and so forth. So.
I just would like to add, mention we put it in a conservation.
That's what I was going to state. So the additional comment is that I believe it goes approximately Toad Road over to Buckmeyer Bend, for those that study maps. And a large,
Incidentally, are about the only two roads that penetrate partially into this otherwise roadless area.
right. And so I think the idea was to not let them connect, and not let Toad Road and Buckmeyer Bend connect. And so you put it into a conservation easement, and I applaud that, and I'm sure generations down the road will continue to applaud that.
Thank you for doing that. We need more of that. A couple of different points. One is, Carrie, you and I think, and my husband all live in what we might call rural residential property. And we weren't born and raised on that land, but we bought it like an acreage. And it was just a few years ago in the New York Times that Lindsay Lucershute, the founder of the National Young Farmers Coalition, wrote quite a diatribe in the opinion page about the problems with young farmers getting access to land. And I thought for sure, because she said the number one problem is, and I'm reading down this column and I'm waiting for her to say suburban sprawl. And instead she says, people who buy 80 acres in the middle of nowhere and take it out of production. Well, we happen to have 80 acres, so she was pretty much talking to me and Paul. And she said, because it raises the price of all the land around it. And it makes it that much less accessible to young farmers, especially when small parcels. That was part of the evolution of silt, was to understand that in our best acts of trying to preserve land, and we are also growing prairie and trees, we might well be making it impossible for young farmers in the area. So just an eye to the fact that just because it's rural residential doesn't mean it's not sprawl, and doesn't mean it's not affecting land prices in a way that's going to determine a lot of other things. Those developers come calling when they see a reason, when they can make more money off the land around you, and that's for
Right.
schools, but it's also for beautiful estates. In terms of buffers, I think that nature-friendly farming, like Blair was I didn't have to repeat what Blair said, but that's what we're going for at Silt, is a great buffer between residential and conventional corn and bean. Not all farms are the same. So it's possible to build in productive ground that's nature-friendly and neighborhood-friendly and creates jobs and draws young people, and have that between your traditional suburban development and your more heavily industrial farming. So I just want to leave those possibilities open.
Yeah.
So that when you're talking about these things, you allow for some of those nuances. By the way, October 3rd, Sustainable Communities Conference in Dubuque, we're giving a talk on building farms into communities. We have a whole panel with developer, a planner, and a nonprofit farm manager from Illinois.
I just want to make sure we get a plug in. What Susan's talking about with SILT is Sustainable Iowa Land Trust, and the website is silt.org. So I would encourage you to go to silt.org and explore what's going on there. And it's certainly addressing this issue of entry into farming at a lower price or lower cost than we normally see.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say that is, thank you for that. And I think your point earlier about figuring out how we can create access to farmland for smaller pieces I'm also on the board of Women Food and Ag Network, and that's a big challenge for a lot of young women who are wanting to get into farming, that they can't buy 80 acres of land or 40 acres. But then you also see a case where there's a lot of abuse. So in Madison County, where they allow the sale of just 5 acres of land, has seen an enormous amount of urban sprawl because it is developers buying that land rather than young farmers. So how do you balance that to ensure that it is young farmers having access to that land?
I think Tom's reference to agricultural conservation easements is one possible solution. Right. It's not one that we floated, by the way, but our easements actually control the housing as well. And so we can control the size of the house or the additions to the house in addition to the use of the land. And I think that's the only way you can do it. And it's private sector and it's voluntary. Yeah. It's not government regulation, but it is new in Iowa. So.
Yeah.
I just wanted to offer an alternative to Tom's image of a small farm and a bunch of houses on the farm around it. Think instead of that 40 acres with 2, maybe 5 acres in the center devoted to agriculture, and the houses around not being on the farm, but being developed by a developer as residential housing. So not, you see what I mean? They're shifting the image.
Right, right.
That's what we're talking about, and I think that may be what Blair was talking about, is it not? Thank you.
And, you can pass
I
it back
think
to Blair,
Blair
but I wanted to make just one more comment about, I think it's important to, when we talk about ag, that we can have a broad perspective of what ag means. Yes, we're Iowans, what first comes to our mind and our heart is row crops. But there are certainly less intense types of plants and crops that can be done. But you also think of animal uses. And I admit, I didn't grow up on a farm, so I don't have, my grandparents own a farm. I don't have that wide a perspective, except that we can be creative. And there's, in the Iowa Code and in our thinking about planning and ag uses, though the land may be hilly or the terrain may not be flat, there are many other things that can be done with that land that do fulfill an agricultural purpose.
Well, yeah, as you drive around town, if you go to places by where we live, there's a number of yards that are pretty obviously not mowed lawns, not sprayed, herbs, fruit trees, raised beds, and these are just beginning examples. Here, I've been around this country, and I've been to Scotland, and I've seen massive examples of gardens in urban areas that have made significant impacts on economy as well as on water conservation, protecting the water, protecting the soil. And I would call your attention and invite you to go and try to figure out my acre of land on the north side. Try to figure it out. Nobody knows how to zone it. It's called Gaia's Peace Garden. There's 70 fruit trees. There's medicinal herbs and plants everywhere. And it's a place for PTSD people to go and sit and relax. It's a healing place. It's certified by United Plant Savers because we grow medicinal herbs and we protect them and propagate them. We supply Backyard Abundance in the spring with herbs to sell at the rec center. And this is just the beginning. I mean, the millet seed is somebody, John Yeagle, I'd invite you all to go visit him sometime and see what an urban farm can do. And I'm saying this in addition to what you're saying about because we have food collapse on the way, in my humble opinion. That's it.
I should have introduced myself. I'm Terry Dobbs. I know most of you here. I'm on planning and zoning and have been for 10 years, so for what it's worth, that makes me ranking member. And I was also on the last Land Use Review Committee. So I've been involved with these issues for a long time. One thing that we're concerned about is setting precedents and unintended consequences. So on the one hand, I'm in favor of these small farms. It sounds like a good concept. I would suggest that we already have a mechanism for that, and that's called the farmstead split, which is 5 acres. The other thing that bothers me, if we change the definition of a farm, and I think this is the unintended consequences, we need to be very careful. And I'm not sure how those are taxed. I think they're taxed as farms, which is a lot less than residential. So on the one hand, I heard you argue against essentially tax abatements or TIFs for developers. But yet on the other hand, you seem to be saying, well, it's okay if we have these small farms which are taxed at a much lower rate than residential. It seems to me that's just a little bit of hypocritical. then it seems, one thing that I object to, it seems like you call it sprawl is the root of all evils. I agree that there are some problems, but, for example, your assertion that sprawl caused or was the result of the new North Liberty High School, I don't think is valid. That was put there because North Liberty and also West are growing and are at capacity, so something had to be done. And to say that the cause of that was sprawl, I think is inaccurate, and I would object to that. So I don't know.
Yeah. Well, first, I don't think either one of us said that sprawl was the cause of the North Liberty High School. It was one of the people in the audience that made the comment. No, one of the people in the audience, and I just responded back to them. But that's okay. Hearing, but no, it was not myself. I was using in an example of
I think the point the
sprawl.
person was making was that putting schools on the edge of town encourages urban sprawl. And we've seen that in Iowa City especially.
Right. However, going back to the tax issue, and I think this is a good thing for planning and zoning to hear, but I think it's probably more important that our supervisors hear it, because for as long as there's been taxes, we've used taxes to drive the kind of communities we want. And right now, taxes are being used in a lot of places to drive communities that most people actually don't want. And so we have to ask our question, what kind of a community and what kind of a county do we want, and how do we use the taxes to, instead of driving urban sprawl, more pavement and creating more problems, how do we use the tax breaks and tax abatement to do a more sustainable community here? And I mean, I think that's a reasonable question to ask, because we know taxes are what drives a lot of things. We know, I mean, that's just the way it is. We know that the government programs around farming are what happened to drive fence row to fence row corn and soybean crops. If you got rid of that and changed the way we did some of the farm programs, you'd probably see a very different image of farming. And it's the same with development. If we, the city of Des Moines is starting to enact a really kind of innovative and progressive idea behind giving tax breaks to corporations, new corporate buildings. So with Wellmark Blue Cross Blue Shield wanted to build a new building and was applying for tax breaks and tax incentives and so forth. And the city of Des Moines basically said, if you want them, you have to build a LEED certified building. And so they're starting to use tax breaks as an incentive to do more sustainability, and not giving the tax breaks if you're not going to do it. So those are, I mean, that's where we should be going with taxes, not using tax abatements to drive urban sprawl. Because we know that right now, nobody's buying that land in Adel. They would only buy it if they thought they were getting 7 years, 100% tax abatement on their houses. And those developers know that people aren't buying those properties out there unless they can have that. And so if we want to make sure we don't have urban sprawl, we take away the tax abatements and we say, we'll give tax abatements for houses in the city, building right in the existing city limits or something like that. So it's just how we use taxes. Other questions?
Well, I wanted to jump in on that point again. The finances, what Carrie's talking about, in central Iowa, it appears, tax abatement seems to be the main tool. Here in Johnson County, our supervisors, let me back up. Some of our cities have gone crazy on TIFs. Those are in the urban area. Our county supervisors have held the line very, very tightly on TIFs in county developments. But there is a financial element to rural residential development. And Carrie started to talk about it a little bit. It's extending that infrastructure out into the rural areas, roads, water, wastewater, ambulance, police, fire, schools. When it's done in a haphazard fashion, when development's done in a haphazard fashion, it makes it so much harder for these public services to operate out there, for one thing, but it's always more expensive to put public services out in areas that have low density. Here's something that people don't always understand, and I always try to emphasize it every time I get a chance. In Johnson County, the county gains on an equally valued piece of property an equal property tax revenue from a residence built in town as a residence built in the county. With one exception, there is the rural levy, which is about 7, 8, or 9% added on to homes in rural areas. Now, that 7, 8, or 9% doesn't come close to paying for $1 million a mile road or another ambulance or any of the other amenities that I just talked about. The bottom line is that new tax revenue, which is what the supervisors were trying to do back in the early 1998 to 2003 with Newport Road, Prairie du Chien, and Sugar Bottom Road. What they were trying to do was, well, if we build up more residences out there, we'll get more tax revenue. Well, it didn't take long to figure out that that plan, it never pays for itself. It's a money-losing proposition, as well as being a bad environmental proposition for all the reasons we've talked about. So this is why residential growth from the city cores outward at a steady pace, which in Johnson County, the experience has been pretty good, with a few exceptions, at the pace of annexation. Now, in the last few years, Coralville and North Liberty got into fighting over some land, but that's been the biggest incident and really the biggest problem we've had. Otherwise, the pace of regular annexation into the rural areas has served us quite well, I think, and will continue to serve us well. So I just wanted to touch on those points of finances. Did you have something more, Carrie, or Blair?
If every development was LEED certified, we wouldn't have as much erosion and this and that. But the other thing I was going to say is that I know of thousands of young people around the planet and that I'm connected to that want to farm and want to farm ecologically, and they want to farm economically, but they want ecology and economics to sit next to each other. And I want to say wonderful things about the Johnson County planning. I want to say wonderful things, but I would suggest that be on the front page of a newspaper. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's just me that missed it, but I've talked to some other people that didn't know this planning was going on. Now maybe some people can connect. But I want to come and just have a voice. I don't want to trump anybody else. Oops, I don't want to outdo anybody else's voice. I just want to add my voice, and I have had 9 years of experience growing a garden. I'm not a professional gardener, but I do know how to grow soil.
Sure. I'm on the Comprehensive Planning Committee, and the notice for forming this committee was in the paper several times, and I think they wound up having to recruit people because people didn't sign up. But I know that there were lots of notices that were sent out, and the meetings have been publicized, and they...
I didn't mean to say that, to blame that in the past. I just say it in the future, maybe be in front page.
Yeah, and if you can get the local papers to do that. But I do think that the public came to some of the meetings and complained because they had to wait for 2 hours to make their comments, and so they changed the public comment period to the beginning of the meeting, and that was much more fair to the people who came. So anyway, I think the process has been a good one, but as I said, they did have to recruit people because they didn't get many people to sign up.
Well, I think we are at the point of wrapping up. Carrie, do you have any closing comments?
I don't. I want to thank you guys all for being here. Different perspectives are all great. Please make sure you get involved. We also have some brochures on the back table. We'd love to have you get involved with 1,000 Friends of Iowa as well. Thank you, guys.
And my closing comments would be to give, again, a little bit of a plug to 1,000 Friends of Iowa. Go to their website, go to their Facebook page. There's material in the back. silt.org, Sustainable Iowa Land Trust is another great organization. And joco.com, sorry, I'll start again. jocoplan.com is the central location for information about the Johnson County Comprehensive Plan. And I urge you to get involved with these meetings on the screen and that we've talked about. I thank you for your participation tonight, and those watching on TV, thank you for your attention. Good night.